Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Well, it's time once again for another one of our Curating Your Movie Library segments, and this time I am without Lisa. I'm waiting for her to come down and record Sacred Marriage with me in just a few minutes, but I thought it would be fitting in this time without her to actually spend a few minutes talking about two shows that we once used to enjoy that we have given up on and don't watch anymore. We tend to be more positive and wanting to share things that you can watch that you might enjoy. And we'll probably get back to that sometime in the future. But for today, I wanted to talk about two shows. One that was certainly pushing the boundaries of propriety, at least insofar as language goes, and another which was really quite sweet and in many ways gentle and safe, both of which I think have kind of gone off the rails. Those two shows are The Marvelous Mrs Maisel. That's the one that was well, it had language issues, had significant language issues, but it was still relatively safe. There was nothing particularly sexual about it, nothing particularly violent about it, nothing particularly occultic about it. To me, it was a pleasant peek into a particular time frame and a particular culture, and Lisa and I enjoyed it for a couple of seasons. But it has sort of at the end of season 3 and now into the current season, it's sort of got really political, not in the sense of who's going to win the election, but in terms of feminism and gender identity and homosexuality and just all the stuff out there. And, you know, it's bad enough to have to put up with that stuff other places, but when you're watching a period piece in a different time frame where these issues weren't front and center like they are now, it's just so unbelievably preachy. It's funny how secular critics always make fun of Christian productions because they're so message driven, and yet they turn around and make this message driven drivel and ruin a perfectly funny show. I'm much more interested in watching Tony Shalhoub as Mrs. Maisel's father navigate his life in New York City in the 1950s than I am listening to Mrs. Maisel herself bloviate about restrictions on women or even again on language. So we kind of bowed out of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, finding it no longer quite so marvelous, and maybe reached the conclusion that maybe we had more patience with the language than we should have as we were walking out the door. Now, with respect to Stranger Things, I think we probably covered that, or at least I did, maybe on years and years ago, because now we're into, I think, season 4, and that's where we stopped. And again, there's a simple reason for this. I'm not saying that it's a sin to watch such things, but I just get really uncomfortable when in general, when we're looking at horror kind of entertainment that is grounded in the supernatural or the demonic realm. At the very beginning of Stranger Things, it was very much I would say more in line with Super 8, where there's mysteries going on that we don't understand. There's enemies going there that we don't understand. And I'm not against that. I'm not against aliens being bad guys or bad men being bad guys or foreigners being bad guys, or, bad guys being bad guys. I have no problem with that at all. It's when it gets into the demonic realm that it's just all of a sudden, in a way, I would say it gets too scary. And by that, I don't mean that the experience of fright of watching the show is too strong, but rather it seems to sort of thin up the veil between here and the demonic realm in our own lives. We don't like that stuff. We don't feel comfortable with that stuff. Again, I'm not saying it's a sin to watch that stuff, but and honestly, it really, really makes me sad. I mean, the whole idea, that whole nostalgic 80s vibe, that whole Steven Spielberg Goonies vibe, the kids themselves, I just thought the kids were great. Really enjoyed them. I've actually not even seen them this season, so I don't know how far they've aged. But I enjoyed the pluckiness of the kids and the loyalty of the kids, and Hop and Winona Ryder, and just all sorts of pleasant things about the show, and the mystery of it all. But now it's gotten, like I say, much, much too dark for me. And I don't know if this is a sign of things to come. If you've been listening regularly, you'll remember that one of our 70s kids segments, I talked about in the 70s how there was this sort of intersection on television between both a much more overtly sexualized programming like Charlie's Angels or Three's Company, and a much more politicized programming like all the Norman Lear shows, and the older, gentler, entertaining shows like The Waltons or the one with Gunsmoke. So maybe we're seeing the same kind of thing in this streaming world, which still is weird and new to me. So that's our thoughts on those two particular shows. We, as always, would love to hear from you. We're always looking for good recommendations, something gentle, not preachy, but something gentle. So we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at hellorcjr@gmail.com. hellorcjr@gmail.com. We come now finally in our series Good News to breaking open the book of Matthew. And you may recall from your own study of the book of Matthew that Matthew begins with an extended genealogy of Jesus. And this genealogy is not simply sort of boring prolegomena or proof texts for how we know this is the right line. This is not the revelation of the laying on of hands from one generation to another. There's something else going on here. Among those things I would suggest are the inclusion in this particular genealogy of scandal and of Gentiles. Now, it is, by and large, Hebrew folks who are part of this genealogy, but we also have Ruth, we also have Tamar, we also have, I forget who else, all sorts of folks. And then we also have this at the end. I like this in verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the captivity in Babylon are 14 generations. And from the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. And what catches my eye about this is that while I am profoundly skeptical, those of you who are old enough to remember things like the Bible Code, sort of Christian Kabbalah, numerology kind of stuff, I have to confess and admit that here there's some sense in which Matthew is doing this. There's a reason for this. I don't know what that reason is, but he's doing this to show us something, if only to show us sort of the equality of these different eras or epochs in the history of God's people. There may be more to it than that. I don't know. But then at this point, Matthew breaks into the story of the conception of Jesus and the birth of Jesus. Now, also, it's interesting to note to me how the different gospel accounts sort of cover different things. My assumption is, if I need to look for something in the very early days of the life of Jesus or leading up to the birth of Jesus, that I should go to Luke. That Luke certainly has the most extensive coverage, which is not very extensive at all, but it is the most extensive coverage of these early days of Jesus. We don't have, for instance, as we will in Luke, an exposition of the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist to Zacharias and Elizabeth. We have very little about even the meeting between Mary and the angel. In fact, it says this in verse 18. Now, the birth of Jesus was as follows. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Then Joseph, being her husband, being a just man, and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. So there's just, again, not so much of the drama. There's not the account of the angels and the wise men and all the stuff that sort of melds together in our celebration of the advent of Christ. It's much more straightforward, much more direct. Matthew finishes this chapter in verse 22. So all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, now referencing Isaiah, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated, God with us. Then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took to him his wife, and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son. And he called his name Jesus. There's a sense of impatience here in Matthew's gospel, that he wants to get to the life and ministry. He doesn't want to shortchange the uniqueness of the birth of Jesus. There is a clear, unambiguous affirmation of the virgin birth of Jesus, but Matthew's interest is sort of laser focused on the life and ministry of Jesus. Now, if you were with us last time, you'll remember we talked about this intertestamental period. And again, one of the things I want you to notice in this account that's still true of Luke, but a little bit less so, is the relative anonymity of all of this. There is no great public announcement of what's happening. There is no, until later in the ministry of John the Baptist, no great prophet that's coming immediately and telling the world, hey, the Messiah's here when he's born. This will wait until Jesus is just about ready for his public ministry. So you've got almost a surreptitious invasion by the living God in the incarnation happening here in Matthew chapter 1. You've got a historical background, so this is not something from out of the blue. This is not something disconnected from what God has been doing in history from the beginning, and that should be very important to us. If you're a Christian and you open up the book of Matthew, you ought to see that Matthew certainly cares about what's in the Old Testament, and so should we. So here's Matthew's sort of bridge between Malachi and the ministry of Jesus. And he's introduced it to us. He's done it quickly and efficiently. And next time we'll go further to see what else Matthew would have us to know. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.